Very good morning to all of you, and let me at the very outset thank Dr. Bhatia and his organization for giving me and all of us the opportunity to be here this morning for what has become more or less the CSR event of the year, which is titled World CSR Day. During COVID times, of course, there was an interruption of a couple of years, but here we are, face to face again, delighted to see all of you. Let me, in my opening remarks, try and trace for you a little bit about what CSR has been for India in particular. When the history of CSR is written, either in India or anywhere in the world, for us here, there are basically two phases. One that happened in all the years prior to the 1st of April 2014. And the second phase, what happened post that date, 1st of April 2014. There are many practitioners here of CSR, and I'm sure they would recognize that date for what it is, because it is on that day that the Companies Act of 2013, and with it, that one section 135 became effective. I still recall that day when I was sitting in the officers' gallery, December of 2013, when Mr. Sachin Pilot was literally piloting the bill in the Lok Sabha. And what he was piloting was the 2013 Companies Bill, as it was then known. There are, some of you may know, 470 sections in that act. Just one, the famous, or at that time infamous, section 135 is the one that pertains to all of us in this room. Since the passage of that legislation, something happened, what you might call actually a tectonic shift from the pre-act days to the post-act days. And many of you will remember for what it was, or what CSR was, pre the act. So what does one call that? One calls that more philanthropy, intermittent, unorganized, unstructured, off and on. I used to call that checkbook charity. And of course, pretty much what you might call backroom CSR. Post the date of 1st of April 2014, all that of course changed, as many of you would know. What happened? What was the change? What were the elements of that change? First of all, it became structured. It became strategic. It became, for one thing, at that time, partially mandatory. Now, of course, it is. In the pre-act era, it was pretty much voluntary. We brought CSR, as I always say, from the back room to the boardroom, because today in India, the CSR committee of the board of the company is individually, personally responsible for all the CSR activities and programs that happen. So we went from backroom to boardroom. We also made sure that what happens in CSR is on project mode. I am famously quoted as saying, if it is not a project, it is not CSR. And therefore, what does that mean? It means primarily that if there is a project, then there is an amount or a budget allotted to that project. There is a baseline survey which assesses the need for why that project is being taken up in the first place. A geographical location is assigned to that project. It is thereafter monitored. It is assigned to an implementing agency. When the project at midterm or thereafter is carefully evaluated to see whether it has produced the desired results, and then there is an evaluation, what we call impact evaluation. Now observe how much CSR therefore gets tracked from the very beginning of the project to the very end. The law that we introduced in the bill of 2013, which thereafter became the Act, there was Section 135, came to be known, again famously or infamously, as the 2% law. Because now all companies who fell within the ambit of Section 135 would need to spend at least 2% of your net profits on CSR activities. Today, India spends approximately 22 to 25,000 crores of Indian rupees every year on CSR. And that spending is done by between 14 to 15,000 companies who fall within the ambit of that Act. As we stand here today and we look back on the 8-year history of CSR in India, very often we assess what has happened, how could it be different, how could it be better. Of course, we also don't look at how could it be worse. But the fact is, if that law or if that piece of legislation had not been passed, the scenario would have remained pretty much what it was before the Act. We are also the only country, just about the only country in the entire planet which actually has a law on CSR. Many countries across the globe are now thinking of whether that is a possibility in their countries. And I know that Malaysia, Sri Lanka, Nepal, and a few other countries have been in talks with the Ministry of Corporate Affairs to see how that legislation can be taken to their countries. It may happen elsewhere, it may not. But the fact remains that our legislation has stood the test of time. And one of those acid tests, the litmus paper literally, was the COVID era, when government made use of that piece of legislation to ensure that whatever companies did for COVID or the COVID affected became part of Section 135, or as you would, practitioners would know, Schedule 7. The question is often asked by those who are uninitiated, what is then CSR? Is there a definition? If government says spend 2%, if government says it is mandatory, if government says that we track what you do, then where is the definition of CSR given by government? How can government legislate without a definition? The answer is that we, as policymakers, did not fall into the obvious trap of defining CSR. And I know that every one of you sitting in this room and everyone outside across the whole planet would have his or her own definition of what CSR is, was, could be. And we have a famous band of people who in India wear black coats, and they're famously known as lawyers, who then interpret every single word of a definition and interpret it in so many ways that it'll end up in complete confusion. Then, what is the solution? And of course, policymakers and government have made that very clear. In Schedule 7 of the Act, all of those activities are described which can be called CSR. If you follow any of those, I think currently there are 14 or 15 items there, any activity that falls within the purview of Schedule 7 is a CSR activity. If it does not fall within the ambit of Schedule 7, it is not a CSR activity. So very clearly, there is a demarcated area within which CSR falls. What I would request every practitioner to do is not just, of course, to read Section 135 and Schedule 7, but from then till now, and I say this with some responsibility, Section 135 has stood the test of time because it has not been changed, it has not been modified. Across all of these 8 years, that piece of legislation has stood exactly as it was passed. What has changed are the rules. And there is only one significant change in the circular of January 2021. Every practitioner, everyone in this room, should know that one circular backwards, because it answers all the queries that were raised over the 7 years prior to January 2021. So whatever little loopholes there may or may not have been adequately covered therein. Which brings me to the fact that we are all here today, not for me to give you an education on what CSR is, but actually to celebrate the fact that CSR was brought in, the raison d'etre of CSR, the reason why we passed the legislation, was basically 2 or 3. Number 1 is the upliftment of the poor, or changing the lives of the underprivileged, the marginalized, the responsibility of government alone? Yes, in one sense, the buck stops there. What the government does for the underprivileged and the poor, of course, is the primary responsibility of government. But should it be just only government's responsibility? And I think everyone has answered that question with a resounding no. And we saw that way back in 2011-12 when we were actually drafting the legislation. And we said, here is a big opportunity to bring the private sector, not all of it, but that private sector which earns a high profit from the investments that it makes, from the work that it does, in the very society in which they live. Can we bring the private sector into the development agenda of the nation? When we track the trajectory of India's development, is there a role for the private sector? Or can the private sector simply say, our job is to make profits and pay taxes? After that, It's up to government. That argument, of course, stopped a long while back, not just in India, but across the globe. And today, when you go to all the platforms and stages where business leaders congregate and they speak, it's so heartening to hear that the talk there is not about the profits they made or the balance sheets of their companies. Every business leader today does and has to speak about what we call give back. What is it that you have done for society, for the planet, for its people? Every corporate house, every single business is identified not merely for what it has earned, but what it does for society at large, for the communities that they serve, the places that they work in. So the dialogue, or the discourse as I prefer to call it, has changed in that way. The second reason, of course, was this. There are efficiencies in the private sector that are not available to government. I served in government not 1 or 2 years, but 41 years. And my gray hairs are testimony to that. You know, with government and with civil service, there are, of course, government is a huge bureaucracy. And the delivery systems in government are not always the most efficient. The private sector brings in innovation, brings in a different kind of energy, brings in efficiencies. And very often we see that the projects or programs that they implement are in fact better run than many of the government programs. So when we conceptualized CSR in India, we did it in what we call the triad, the triangular format. At the apex of that pyramid is government, which is regulatory, which is facilitating, and at the two ends of the base there is the private sector, which provides resources, monetary resources, provides the monitoring, provides the evaluation, provides the stock taking, and most importantly, the other end of the base, which is civil society. It is the NGOs, it is civil society organizations which actually do the implementation of the programs. It was not our expectation that those with the suits and boots and ties sitting in their fancy corporate offices would descend down to communities, take off their shoes, roll up their jeans or whatever, and start soiling their hands. It was our intention that those who live in communities, those who work for communities, those whose lifeblood is the community, civil society organizations, they understand why there is poverty and how can we make our small little attempt to try and uplift those or give the marginalized a chance to live a dignified life. It is they who I wanted to bring into the mainstream of CSR. And happily you see that triangular model working so beautifully like a well-oiled engine. Government passed the legislation, tracks it across the space. The private sector provides the resources and assesses performance at which they are excellent. And civil society, which actually does the physical work at the grassroots level. It is that triangular model which is the beautiful exemplification of what we in India do as CSR. I wanted to make these opening remarks because in a way I feel so proud, and it warms the cockles of my heart to see that the legacy of that CSR is being passed on to a new generation. Pre 2014, we spoke of CSR in generic terms. Today, CSR is an industry. It is a sector. It is a place where people find their livelihoods. It is a place where people find fulfillment. It allows the young who enter into professions the ability to see that the vertical climb in their organization ends not at mid-level, but at board level. It's wonderful to see that any company worth its salt has a CSR department, a CSR vertical. And the applications for any CSR position, and I, of course, head up one of those verticals in one of the biggest companies of the country now, post my stint with government. And I see the kind of people who want to do or get into CSR. One other thing that I see, and I'll conclude here, is that many of the positions that we float internally for doing CSR, the applicants are not necessarily those who've done social work or work with NGOs or work, but there are engineers, there are doctors, there are professionals, there are management graduates who are all colliding or competing with each other for the CSR position. And I think that is the real tribute to what CSR is today. Aspirationally, it's where people want to be. And when the CSR professional walks or talks, there is the inherent confidence, the belief that my profession is respected, it is admired, it is in fact even sought after by virtually everyone in the room. And that really is the change, that is the transition that CSR has undergone. Complete, total, transformational. Thank you very much for giving me a patient listening.